Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to decode a super weird, almost hidden phenomenon that plays out literally every single day. We see it in boardrooms, classrooms, history books, you name it. There's this quiet, creeping horror that really deep thinkers eventually have to face. They speak up, and the room just kind of nods, slowly, tolerating them the same way you tolerate a little kid who just confused the names of two countries. They aren't mocked outright because that would be too clean. They're just dismissed. So today, we are going to look at the actual structural laws behind why extreme intelligence is so often mistaken for flat-out stupidity by the masses.
Okay, let's dive right into this paradox. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche actually recognized this dynamic, and he wrote about it with the cold patience of a guy who knew he'd already lost the battle. He noted, "The higher the type of human, the more rarely they are understood." And he said it's not because they're hiding, no, it's because they exist on a frequency the herd just doesn't pick up. Think of it like this. When you're standing dead center in the middle of the bell curve, looking out at the extreme edges, well, both directions look exactly the same. Intelligence too far ahead looks exactly like intelligence too far behind.
To most people, the genius and the fool actually look identical in a social setting. Why is that? Well, because both of them pause just a little too long before answering. Both of them totally refuse the obvious, simple answer that everyone else in the room is eagerly nodding along to. Now, let's be totally honest with ourselves here. We all like to think our long pauses are the genius kind. But seriously, both the simpleton and the genius seem to be standing slightly outside the room, watching from a place the rest of the group can't quite reach. And because of that, they trigger the exact same internal alarm in the crowd. That, hey, they're not one of us, alarm. So they get greeted with the exact same gentle, polite dismissal.
Section 1. The mechanics, speed, and translation. Let's move on and see how this builds by examining the actual behavioral reasons why deep thinking gets so fiercely penalized in social settings.
It all starts with how we actually process information. Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman divided the human mind into two engines. System 1 is fast, automatic, and, honestly, kind of shallow. It pattern matches and spits out an answer before the question is even fully heard. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, and metabolically expensive. It holds variables, it tests them. So the room instinctively credits the quick System 1 thinker. When the slow System 2 thinker takes a pause, the room completely misreads that silence as ignorance. But it isn't an absence of thought. That pause, it's literally the sound of an entire orchestra warming up before the very first note.
Now, what's really interesting here is how this reveals the fundamental structural flaw of social life. The room rewards cheap, manufactured confidence while totally penalizing the expensive, hard-to-display nuance of the actual thinker. As Bertrand Russell famously pointed out, the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. The thinker isn't afraid of being rejected, right? They're afraid of the room receiving this flattened, badly compressed version of their idea and then acting on it terribly. So what do? They layer in conditions and caveats, which the room, of course, just hears as total confusion.
And this brings us to what we call the translation tax. See, the genius perceives thoughts in incredibly high resolution. But the room only accepts low resolution. So every single time the deep thinker speaks, they are forced to compress this gorgeous, subtle 8-condition thought into a blunt 1-condition sentence. And that translation inevitably loses exactly what made the thought worth saying in the first place. It's a real catch-22. If the thinker refuses to compress it, well, they just sound completely unclear or elitist to the rest of the room.
Section 2. The curse of early truths. We're now going to escalate from simple behavioral mismatches in conversation straight to massive historical tragedies. We're looking at the fatal cost of being correct way before the world is ready to hear it.
Back in 1882, Nietzsche wrote this absolutely chilling parable about a madman. This guy runs into a marketplace in broad daylight, carrying a lantern, shouting that he's looking for God. The crowd just laughs at him. And then he realizes he's come too early. The lightning is struck, but the thunder has not yet arrived. Nietzsche was basically warning us that anyone whose perception runs ahead of their era will functionally sound deranged. Society simply doesn't have the internal scaffolding built yet to hang those new ideas on. And this brilliantly illustrates the real stakes of arriving too early. Just look at this timeline. In 1912, Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift. The guy was literally mocked out of his profession and died in 1930 with his theory completely rejected. Decades later, it becomes the absolute foundation of modern geology. Or take Barbara McClintock. She presented evidence of jumping genes in the 1940s. Her colleagues dismissed her as confusing and mystical. She worked in near isolation until she finally won the Nobel Prize at age 81. These incredible minds saw the lightning decades before the thunder ever arrived. To truly grasp why the room behaves like this, we have to look at Solomon Asch's famous 1951 conformity experiments. He proved that 3/4 of people, 75%, will actively deny the clear, undeniable evidence of their own eyes just to conform to the consensus of a room. 3/4. That is wild. And it highlights the permanent social cost the lonely genius pays. Being the only person who actually sees reality clearly is an incredibly expensive, isolating position to hold. Section 3. The refusal to perform. Let's shift our explainer into the psychological root of this dynamic. We've talked about how the genius is misread, but now we need to understand why the true genius actively refuses to perform those expected social calculations that would, frankly, just make their lives a whole lot easier.
Schopenhauer realized something fascinating about this whole dynamic. He argued that the ordinary mind is basically a servant of the will. It thinks purely in service of strategy, personal wants, and social position. Performing competence is just a strategic act for them. But the genius mind, their intellect has completely slipped its leash. It thinks entirely for its own sake. They miss the social signals simply because they aren't even running the social calculations at all. The strategic will inside them has just gone totally quiet.
A completely perfect example of this happened in 1935. A 24-year-old physicist named Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar presented the math proving what we now know as black holes. Well, the most famous astrophysicist of that era, a guy named Arthur Eddington, publicly humiliated him. He called the work absurd, and the entire audience laughed at this kid. But Chandrasekhar refused to perform a slightly dumber version of himself just to appease Eddington. He carried his unrounded truth intact for 30 years, even though Eddington's authority completely stalled his funding. Talk about standing your ground. But look, most thinkers do not have Chandrasekhar's incredible stamina. For those lacking it, Nietzsche warned of a super tragic alternative, what he called the death of the higher type by exhaustion. Now, this isn't an execution. It's way worse. It's a slow self-erasure. The thinker survives socially by learning to round their answers down. They make themselves less. They save their true, unrounded, brilliant thoughts for journals nobody will ever read, all just so the room will tolerate them. Section 4. The Cassandra Curve. The absolutely crucial point here is that society doesn't just misread the genius by accident. No, the misreading serves a vital protective function. Society actively misreads them when the truth is simply too expensive to accept. Consider the incredibly tragic case of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis in 1846 Vienna. He noticed a horrifying discrepancy in the hospital maternity wards. Get this, the clinic staffed by actual doctors and medical students had a terrifying 18% mortality rate. Meanwhile, the second clinic, which was staffed only by midwives, had a rate of just 2%. Semmelweis realized the key difference. The doctors were coming directly from the autopsy room. He proposed they were carrying invisible, cadaverous particles on their hands from the corpses to the mothers. So Semmelweis institutes strict hand washing with chlorinated lime. Guess what happens? The mortality rate in the doctor's clinic immediately plummets to 2%. The data was completely undeniable. And yet, the medical establishment entirely rejected him. Why on earth would they do that? Because if Semmelweis was right, it meant the doctors had been unknowingly murdering women by the thousands for decades. He was mocked, isolated, and eventually committed to an asylum where he died. His truth required a confession the room simply could not afford to make. Section 5. The mirror they cannot bear. This brings us to the darkest, most psychologically intense layer of our explainer. Because the truth is, the masses punish the genius, not for being wrong, but for being a mirror.
Think about it. When an average person is sitting in a room with someone who is clearly sharper than them, they really only have two psychological options. Option 1, they can expensively adjust their own self-image downward, basically accepting that their super confident opinions are way less reliable than the quiet person's. Or option 2, the psychologically free route. They can simply dismiss the genius as arrogant, difficult, pretentious, and weird. And let's be real, almost everyone, almost always, takes that second option.
It's exactly like the freed prisoner in Plato's allegory of the cave. When the prisoner returns to tell everyone else about the sunlight outside, his truth totally threatens the comfort of the people staring at the shadows on the wall. The genius's very existence is a walking critique of the room. So to protect their own fragile egos and their reality, the room just decides to call the mirror cracked rather than actually look into it.
Which leaves us with this final lingering question. If any of this resonated with you today, the pause that gets read as confusion, the exhausting translation tax, or that incredibly lonely feeling of arriving too early, ask yourself right now, what are you sacrificing to stay in the room? Are you rounding yourself down? Please, do not become small just to be permitted near the herd. The cost of belonging shouldn't be the erasure of the very intellect that makes your belonging worth offering in the first place. Stop performing for a room that refuses to look in the mirror.